Good evening, everyone. My name is Bruce Byrd. I'm the General Counsel of Palo Alto Networks. I'm going to introduce one of the more anticipated programs of our annual meeting. Earlier this year, Palo Alto Networks hosted a presentation by and discussion with Desmond Ang, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. Professor Ang has researched the impact of the film The Birth of a Nation and its contribution to the spread and perpetuation of white supremacist views and anti-Black bigotry.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Sandra Yamate. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession, or IILP. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, From Imagery to Reality, The Birth of a Nation to Black Lives Matter and the Implications for DEI Efforts. We're pleased that you've joined us. Our legal profession remains one of the least diverse professions in the country, and we've all invested countless hours trying to address and change that. Before the pandemic, there was tremendous focus on implicit bias. Everyone was receiving implicit bias training, but there were shortcomings. For many, the response was something like, oh, I'm not a bad person. I may have these implicit biases, but so does everyone else. And since they're implicit, unconscious, there's nothing that we can really do about them. But that's not really true. And today's program is about moving the legal profession forward another step by addressing implicit bias by beginning to understand their sources, how they can be transmitted from one generation to the next, and once we're aware of them, how to address them. So now I'd like to turn the program over to Bruce Byrd, who is Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Palo Alto Networks, our host for today, and the Chairman of IILP.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you so much, Sandra and IILP, for putting this on. And thank you all for the participants, the attendees, for taking your time to come here and talk about these important issues. I'm just going to share my screen right now. Have a bit of a slideshow. I am an economist, so there was a lot of empirical rigor that went behind this presentation, but I'm hopefully going to save you guys from some of the boredom there. And today what we'll be talking about is The Birth of a Nation, which is a historical film that was very popular in this country, and more generally the role of media on the proliferation of racial violence and hate-based ideologies. So just to sort of provide a bit of motivation to this topic, as I'm sure you're all aware, in recent years, there's been a lot of concern in public discourse and in private conversations as well about the potential role of media on inciting some of these harmful behaviors, things like violence, things like racial discrimination, et cetera. In the public sphere, we've seen this play out sort of coming from both sides of the aisle. So Senator Bernie Sanders tweeted at one point towards former President Trump, imploring him to stop his racist, hateful, and anti-immigrant rhetoric for fear that that type of language would create a climate that emboldens violent extremists. Again, this concern about media, about speech, and how that might inflame violence. Senator Chuck Grassley, who's a Republican, was referencing violent movies more generally, and he said, you see all these films about people being blown up. Well, just think of the impact that makes on young people. The backdrop to this has been a heightened rise in hate crimes and acts of mass violence across this country. As one sort of example of this, an extreme example of this, and the potential concerns that media might play in inciting violence, Dylan Roof, who was sort of the white supremacist who murdered 9 Black parishioners in a Charleston, South Carolina church, attributed his own actions to white supremacist websites that he visited, as well as the media coverage of the Trayvon Martin killing. And so obviously there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, reasons for us to be concerned about the role of media on racial discrimination and racial prejudice. However, if you think about actually identifying this causal effect, it's actually really difficult to know in many circumstances whether media is simply just reflecting audience behaviors and beliefs or whether it actually affects it. And so one common example that you could think of is if you think about, the viewership for Fox News versus MSNBC. Obviously, Fox News attracts many more conservative audience members. MSNBC attracts many more liberal audience members. And that could very much be just the fact that people with certain ideological preferences are opting in to watch media content or news content that sort of reflects their own beliefs and preferences, rather than this causal effect of slanted news on actual behavior or political preferences. More generally, a lot of research that we have thinking about sort of the effects of media, specifically on things like violence, is based in the lab, based in, for example, they're showing short clips to people in lab settings and asking them questions about their aggression. And more generally, there's this concern that a lot of this research is going to be limited to thinking about the effects of media on people who have already had significant exposure to media. So, for example, if we were thinking about, what's the impact of a marginal sort of clip of violent media on somebody's actions or behavior or preferences, that's in consideration of the fact that people have already seen many violent images in their lifetimes, that they've already seen many violent movies and films and TV shows in their lifetime. And so we might not necessarily expect those marginal exposures to have much impact. We also might not think that whatever we do find would be reflective of sort of like the underlying impact of media on people's development, on their societal views, etc. So the American Psychological Association estimates that the average American has seen over 200,000 violent acts on television by the time they're 18 years old. And so again, if we think about, well, what's the marginal impact of another violent film, you can imagine that's really small, but it doesn't mean that violent films in general don't have a huge impact on how our society is formed, people's day-to-day behaviors, etc. It's just that we're not necessarily able to estimate this at the margins. More generally, a lot of the most culturally significant media events that you can imagine, things like Game of Thrones in recent years, things like the Vietnam War coverage when they were showing videos of soldiers' bodies coming back from Vietnam, things like in the past few years, before he was banned from Twitter, former President Trump's tweets, all of these things you can imagine having really big impacts on society, and even sort of like in day-to-day conversations. Clearly, that's the thing that consumes what we talk about, what we're thinking about, etc. But it's often very difficult to identify these effects precisely because these events are so widely viewed, so culturally significant, that it's very hard to think of anybody who hasn't been exposed to them. And we often need that control group to really think about what the causal effects of something is, right? However, there was a time in history when it is much more easy for us to sort of identify these impacts of media on racial violence, on racial prejudice, etc. And that's the advent of the first American blockbuster. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a 1915 film by a very well-known director named D.W. Griffith. And the name of the film was The Birth of a Nation. This movie, as I'll describe later in this talk, it's sort of insanely popular in hindsight, to realize what a large and sort of like groundbreaking film this was in American cinematic history. It's also just like incredibly racist, and in fact, the entire plot of the movie is essentially about the founding, the origins of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, during the Reconstruction era of this country. And anecdotally, this film is very widely credited with sort of the rebirth of the KKK. And so the film very much valorizes the KKK, as I'll talk about. The KKK didn't actually exist when the movie came out. They had been sort of disbanded after Reconstruction. When the movie came out in 1915, the KKK was then sort of inspired to be reborn again shortly thereafter. So just to give you sort of a layout of the context in which this film was released, this chart just shows you during this time period in the early 1900s, trends in lynchings and race riots in this country, as well as trends in the number of KKK members that existed at any given point in time. This gray area in this chart shows you when the movie was released, when The Birth of a Nation was released, as well as this 5-year time period when the movie was being premiered across different theaters in this country. And again, when the movie was first released, the KKK just didn't exist. There were 0 members of the KKK because they had been disbanded after the passage of the Enforcement Acts in the late 1800s. 6 months after the movie was released, the KKK was founded again. It was reborn. The second KKK was founded. And then about a decade after the movie was released, the KKK had essentially exploded. There's over 4 million members in 1924, which is something like 1 in 6 of the eligible population. So 1 in 6, sort of like white native-born males were part of the KKK in 1924. And during this time period when the film was released, you can also see clearly there's a spike in lynchings, a spike in race riots that coincides when this movie was being toured around the country. And the purpose of this research is really to be able to disentangle how much of this was being driven by the film rather than just other things that were going on during the country, in the country during this time period. Okay. And again, the reason why this setting is a really unique setting for us to be able to really estimate and zoom in on the impact of media on racial preferences, racial violence, racial prejudice, etc., is the fact that this movie came out at a time when our media markets weren't so saturated. So nowadays, when a movie comes out, it premieres at every AMC in the country, and there's AMCs essentially everywhere in this country. It might also premiere, for example, on HBO Max or some other streaming services, where essentially everybody can be exposed to the movie at the same time. It becomes much harder to think about identifying causal effects in that type of situation. When The Birth of a Nation premiered in 1915, it premiered at a time when even the movie theater industry was very much in its infancy. So less than 60% of counties in this country had a movie theater in 1915. And so there is clear geographic variation in who could even see the film. You had to live close to a theater to even be able to see this movie. And again, even beyond that, there was variation in timing of when you could see that movie. So the movie came out and it was distributed via this very extensive roadshow, which was sort of the first of its kind and the largest of its kind, where the movie distributors took the movie from town to town over this 5-year period. They would set up shop in the town for about a weekend or a week, and then they'd move on to another town. And so we have this very clear variation in terms of when the movie shows up in a certain area, as well as which areas could conceivably have even received the movie. And so we'll be able to exploit this sort of like incomplete and staggered distribution of the film to examine the effects of the movie on local racial hate. So just to give you a bit more context and background about the movie. So this movie is actually on YouTube if you're ever so inclined to watch it. In terms of the plot, it's based, first of all, it's based on a novel by Thomas Dixon called Klansman. So again, you can see the extent to which this is very much rooted in the viewpoint of the KKK. And the plot generally follows two movies, sort of an epic that follows these two families over an extended time period spanning the Civil War, the Reconstruction. The main bad guy in the movie, if you want to think of him like that, is this Northerner, Austin Stoneman, who is an abolitionist, and he is actually based on Thaddeus Stevens, the Republican Thaddeus Stevens. So the bad guy is a guy who's sort of advocating for the abolition of slavery. The good guy in the movie, the person that everyone's rooting for when they're watching this movie, is Ben Cameron, who's from the southern family of Camerons. And the protagonist, again, is literally the guy who, in this fictional retelling, founds the KKK. Okay, so everyone's rooting for this guy, Ben Cameron. During the course of the movie, he founds the KKK in order to fight Northern oppression. And so it's probably not surprising to you that the movie is rife with a number of very heinous and racist depictions of African Americans. Specifically, one very common trope is this idea of African Americans, men specifically, as being sexual predators. And so there's a very infamous scene in which this white actor in blackface, who's playing a freedman named Gus, is chasing through the woods this sort of pure white girl, sort of professing his love to her. Rather than succumbing to his wishes, this girl, she's one of the Camerons, Flora Cameron, decides to jump off of the cliff to kill herself. And then shortly thereafter, the KKK rides into town. They try Gus and they hang him, and then they burn their cross. Okay, so clearly you can see there's a ton of racist tropes illustrated through the movie. A lot of these same tropes exist even today in a lot of different forms. And you can see that clearly the KKK is sort of the heroes of the film. African Americans are sort of very much villainized. And so again, the movie throughout the film is very much glorifying this KKK. This is, again, they're trying to depict this Reconstruction era KKK, the first KKK. Here's another scene. This is essentially at the climax of the movie where the KKK rides into town and again rescues this young white girl from the clutches of a black man. And this, at this point, sort of historical newspaper accounts of the time suggest that like essentially everyone in the theater is on their feet and hollering and clapping and very much sort of in support of what's happening here. Okay. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, The Birth of a Nation is widely credited with the founding of the second KKK. So the movie comes out in March of 1915. On Thanksgiving Day of that same year, a Methodist preacher by the name of William Sirmans decides that he's going to, refound the KKK. So he's inspired by the movie. He's going to resurrect this defunct institution. And in his own telling, Sirmans had said, The Birth of a Nation helped the Klan tremendously in terms of sort of propagating its image, propagating the idea of this organization, even the concept of it. And so the organization that grew out of this movie, the second KKK, was actually far larger, far more widespread and prevalent than even the initial KKK, the organization in which the film is sort of like depicting. So the first KKK, that of the Reconstruction era, only had about 500,000 members. It was a very secretive organization. There was no sort of like central hierarchy to it, and is only really located in the south of this country. The second KKK was located in every state, and again, there's over 4 million members by 1924. And so again, there's clearly this evidence that the KKK was very much exploded onto the scene after this movie came out. But furthermore, there's a lot of evidence that the exact practices, like what the KKK does and represents and wears even, were essentially direct inventions of The Birth of a Nation. And many of these same practices continue to exist today. So first is the fact that the KKK, prior to this movie coming out, never actually burned a cross. That wasn't the thing they did. The director of the movie, as well as sort of the author of the book on which the movie is based, thought this idea of cross burning, which comes from Scotland, was like this cool thing to do. And so then they had the KKK members do that in the movie. And then that obviously that imagery very much propagated, and it became very much sort of a rite of passage and a thing that the KKK now does on a semi-regular basis. Okay. And so again, the first KKK never burned crosses. The first cross burning in the US, the recorded instance of it was actually at the founding of the second KKK, based on essentially what these individuals had seen in the movie. Furthermore, the first KKK didn't have these standard white uniforms. So again, the movie is trying to depict this first KKK. It's doing so in a way that, it's taking many liberties, one of which is this idea that these KKK members should be wearing these white robes and white hoods. That wasn't the case of what actually happened historically. Historically, the initial members of the KKK often wore things like animal horns, wizards' caps, or even flour sacks, precisely because they didn't want to be identified with each other. At the time, the KKK was somewhat outlawed, and so they didn't want to be, heralding the fact that they're part of this organization. The movie comes out. In the movie, these individuals are depicted as wearing these white robes. That becomes very much synonymous with what the Klan does and what they wear even today. Okay. So a lot of reasons to believe that there's obviously this causal effect of this movie on some of the practices of the Klan. At the same time, this movie, The Birth of a Nation, was just far ahead of its time in sort of a cinematic sense. And so if you've ever taken sort of a film history class or a filmmaking class in college, you've probably seen or at least heard about The Birth of a Nation. So this was a movie that was on a scale that was completely different than any other movie that came out at the time. Back then, there were a lot of these sort of like silent, plotless movies that people would watch that were sort of like 10 minutes long. This movie was 3 hours long. It had a huge budget. There were a lot of modern editing techniques. There's these big staged violent fight scenes and action scenes, etc. A lot of the things that we associate with blockbusters today was essentially sort of like first put onto the scene, first put on the map by The Birth of a Nation. The movie, as a result of all these cinematic spectacles that were inherent to it, remains one of the third highest grossing movie of all time. So if you adjust for inflation, the ticket sales for this movie is third only to things like Avatar and Avengers Endgame. So when the movie came out, obviously there's this very racist theme. It was also at the time sort of this incredibly entertaining form of media that people had never seen before, and so it was incredibly popular across the country. It's sort of very hard for me to understate the extent to which people were just dying to see this movie. So newspaper estimates at the time say close to 50% of adults in Baltimore, Boston, and New Orleans saw the film. You can clearly see that these are very different parts of the country that even back then had very different sort of political preferences, racial sentiments, etc. Across all these different areas, there was a huge demand for the movie. Billboard magazine at the time went so far as to say there's absolutely nothing in the film that a sane mind can object to. And so everyone wanted to see the film, but due to, again, this idea that the theater industry at the time was just in its infancy, not everyone was able to see the film. And so the distributors were only able to take the movie to places that had theaters and playhouses with sufficient capacity to house, all this projection equipment, this live orchestra that went with the band, that went with the film, etc. And so as a result of that, there was this slowness in terms of the rolling out of the film, as well as these very severe geographic restrictions on where the film could even go. Like, it couldn't just play at your local Nickelodeon. It had to go to a place that had a sufficient capacity to be able to house a lot of this equipment that went with it. So again, newspapers at the time are essentially lamenting the extent to which the elaborateness of the mounting and accessories for the film forbids its multitudinous reproduction. There's this quote from the Denver Times in 1916, I believe, where they're essentially talking about how New York is 2,000 miles away from us. And the film, as a result, is going to take a really, really long time to even reach Denver. Okay. So people at the time, everyone kind of knew about the film, but not everyone was really able to see it. And that's very much going to allow us to really think about, okay, what are the causal impacts of this film on different outcomes? Because, again, not everyone was able to see it, despite there being this underlying preferences to watch it. And so to figure out where and the film went, much less what the impacts of that film were on local racial prejudice, first we had to find information on where the film was shown. There's obviously no central database keeping track of all this information. And so what I did was I went through historical newspaper archives to identify Birth of a Nation advertisements to determine when and where the film was shown. Again, a lot of this information has been digitized over time. And so we're able to really pick out some of these advertisements. And here's an example advertisement that you can see that's very representative of the advertisements for the Birth of a Nation more generally. And you can see that the way in which this movie was sort of advertised is very much in line with how we advertise films today. So it wasn't so much like, this is a super racist movie that you should come to see if you love the KKK. Instead, it was very much, okay, here's this huge blockbuster that took a lot of money and time to produce. It's telling this very epic tale that's going to pull on your heartstrings, pull on your sort of thirst for watching action movies, etc. All of these things are sort of the same hallmarks that we see in big blockbusters today, which is like, this is the big spectacle, like, come watch this thing. Okay. And so again, this is going to lead a lot of people to watch this movie, where it's not necessarily that it's going to be the case that only the most racist people are going to watch the movie. Almost everybody, if you were white in this country, wants to watch this movie during this time period. And so we'll use this information on where the movie played, and we're going to merge it with information on where theaters were located during this time period, as well as where Klan chapters were eventually located, as well as the prevalence of hate crimes. Okay? And just to show you this visually, on the left here, we just have a map of where the Birth of a Nation was shown in this country, the different counties in which it was shown during this 5-year roadshow period. And it's color-coded by when the movie arrived in these different areas. One thing that you'll notice, or you won't jump out of the page at you, is the fact that this movie wasn't just shown in those areas that historically you might think of as being the most racist, i.e. the Deep South. Instead, the movie premiered all across the country. There was also not a clear sort of pattern with regards to the timing of when the movie arrived in different areas. It's not like it arrived in the South first before going to less racist areas later. Instead, it was very much a bit more random, based on the location of rail lines, based on various demographic concerns that distributors had about reaching relatively popular areas or areas of high density of people, etc. Okay. And so again, what we'll do is we're going to essentially look at this variation, compare the variation in where the movie is shown to the variation in where the Klan chapters would eventually be located. Okay. Okay. And so first, just to look at the effects of sort of the immediate effects of the film arriving and its impacts on racial violence in the area. We can exploit, again, the staggered distribution of the film going to different areas at different times to look at what happens to acts of, how do trends in racial violence look in the months before and after the film arrived in a given county. Here's what we find. So on the left here, this panel A, what we're looking at is lynchings. And so these dots correspond to the difference in lynchings between control counties and treatment counties before and after, in the months before and after the movie arrived in the area. And what you'll notice is that, immediately sort of corresponding with the timing of the movie's arrival in the county, there's this spike in lynchings, right? So these areas are about 5 times more likely to experience a lynching after the movie, in the month after the movie came to your county. On the right, we can look at effects on race riots. So how likely were you to have a race riot in a given county? You'll see again, the movie comes to an area and there's this spike in race riots as well, okay? So clear evidence that this movie obviously brings the shock factor of actually inciting racial violence, racial animosity in different areas. Okay, and this is only again looking at some margins of racial violence. We don't have information on all hate crimes that existed during this time period. We don't have information on other forms of racially motivated acts that weren't as extreme as things like lynchings or race riots, just because of data constraints. But what we do find, again, is just this idea that this movie comes and has this direct impact on viewers that's then leading individuals to perhaps lose their natural inhibitions, maybe to gather with people that are like-minded as them, to then commit these very heinous acts of racial violence. Okay. We can then look at what are the longer run effects. So was it actually responsible for fueling the growth of the KKK in the decades that followed when the movie was released? And so the way that we'll do this is really a similar idea, which is we want to compare areas that received the birth of a nation and screened the birth of a nation to areas that didn't screen the birth of a nation. The issue, of course, here is that more racist areas might have been both more likely to show the movie and to support white supremacist groups. So even if the birth of a nation didn't come to your area, the areas in which it wanted to go to, i.e. more racist areas, might have been more likely to have a KKK chapter later on anyways. And so to sort of overcome this issue, what we'll do is we'll leverage the location of movie theaters before the movie premiered to predict where the movie would be shown. Okay, so again, theater presence during this time period, there weren't theaters in every county, there weren't big theaters in every county, much less. And so we can essentially look at, if we think on some level, after we control for things like county population, demographics, population density, income in the area, etc., it's somewhat random whether or not this county has a theater in 1914 versus building a theater in 1920, right? And so in that regard, that's we would think somewhat random relative to racial preferences in the area, but clearly has a very strong predictive relationship with whether or not the movie could come to your area, okay? And so what we'll do there is essentially use these theaters, the location of these theaters, to predict areas that will receive the birth of a nation, and then use that to look at the causal effect of the birth of a nation on the formation of Klan chapters in a given area, okay? And so first, just to show you, this is just, not to get too into the gory details, but this is just showing you that theater presence in 1914, a year before the movie came out, is uncorrelated with a number of different measures of racism that existed prior to the movie coming out. So again, this is just to show you that theater presence, we think, is not correlated with things that you might drive demand for the movie, or drive demand for the KKK, rather. But it is highly correlated with actually receiving the film. And so areas that were predicted to receive the film based on the fact that they had a theater actually were much more likely to receive the film. That's all this graph is showing you. And furthermore, this relationship that we see here between having a theater, predicting your treatment status, i.e. being able to show the movie, really only holds in areas where the movie wasn't banned. And so Kansas, the government of Kansas during this time period decided to ban The Birth of a Nation. So it was never shown in Kansas until the mid-1920s, in part because he was worried about this exact idea that the movie was going to inflame its white residents against its black residents. And in Kansas, which you can see on this left graph, having a theater in 1914 is uncorrelated with having a Klan chapter in the future, okay? Whereas in non-banned states, so in states, i.e. every other state that wasn't Kansas, having a theater in 1914 is very predictive of having a Klan chapter in the future. Okay, all of which again is to say that we think the mechanism by which theaters are affecting having a Klan chapter in the future is very much through the predictive power that that has in terms of actually showing the birth of a nation. Okay. And so then when we use that, we can combine all that information to then look at, okay, what's the impact of actually showing the movie as instrumented by having a theater on the likelihood of having a Klan chapter in the future. And here's these effects again. And the way to interpret this is the likelihood, the additional likelihood of having a Klan chapter in a county by a certain year, as predicted by actually having shown the birth of a nation. Okay. And so in 1930, you'll see that counties that showed the birth of a nation were about 60 percentage points more likely to have a clavern, which is the name of a Klan. It's a stupid name, but it's a Klan. It's the name of what KKK members call their local chapters. These counties that showed the movie were about 60 percentage points more likely to have a clavern by 1930. And this is a causal effect. So this is a causal effect of showing the birth of a nation on your likelihood of having a Klan chapter. And we can see that this is relatively persistent over time. Okay. And if we look to see, okay, what are the areas in which the movie inspired, you know, the founding of Klan chapters, local Klan chapters, the growth of local Klan chapters, what you'll actually see is that the film had a strong effect on Klan support essentially all across the nation. It wasn't just that this film was inspiring the formations of Klan chapters in areas that were already very racist. It was also inspiring the formation of Klan chapters in other areas as well, whether or not you're looking in the Deep South, not in the Deep South, whether or not a county is very far from a major city, whether it's more central to a major city, regardless of sort of political preferences, etc. This movie was just really inspiring for people to sort of like create these Klan chapters. Again, in a way that you can imagine is somewhat unconscious to sort of the idea of watching the movie to begin with. People wanted to watch a movie because it was baked in the sea. Watching it, despite the fact that they might not have been the most racist person to begin with, when they're walking out of the theater, they're then, you know, kind of thinking, well, this is kind of a cool idea. This organization that maybe I should try to support or join. Okay. Clearly very illustrative of the dangers of even sort of like some of these forms of entertainment media that you might think of as being a bit more innocuous. Okay. And so, you know, I think so far what we've shown is that the birth of a nation, in line with a lot of these historical anecdotes, very much facilitated the rise of the second KKK. These areas that showed the movie were much more likely to have a Klan chapter by 1930. And this is, again, true across a diverse set of areas, which really, again, suggests the film's role in popularizing and elevating this relatively fringe organization. Again, people might not have even heard of the KKK before they watch the movie. They come out of the movie thinking that this is sort of this great organization that is very much rooted in American history. Okay. Now, thinking about contemporaneous effects, contemporary effects of the birth of a nation. So what happens, you know, to areas today that show the movie historically? Do they look different than areas that didn't? Here, what we can look at is the presence of having any hate group in the 21st century. How is that predicted by or not predicted by whether or not the birth of a nation was screened locally in 1915? What we find is that areas that showed the movie historically, again, sort of in this causal way, leads to these areas being much more likely to have a hate group today, both an increased likelihood of having a Klan chapter today, as well as the increased likelihood of having some other form of white supremacist hate group today. And these areas are also much more likely to have higher rates of hate crimes today, both towards African Americans, but also towards other minority groups, okay? And this is actually perhaps the scariest part of these findings, is that there's this evolution of the KKK that happened over time, over this past 80 years, in which that organization began to antagonize other groups. So historically, the KKK was very much targeted towards African Americans. They then targeted certain religious minorities, sexual minorities, as well as racial minorities in such a way that these areas that showed the movie then were much more likely to have a Klan chapter. Those Klan chapters, their ideology evolved in a way that then leads to them sort of antagonizing other groups, committing hate crimes against other groups, not just African Americans. Okay. And so just to wrap up, what we find in the study is that the Birth of a Nation obviously incited these very short-run effects on racial violence that we see with the lynchings and the race riots, but it also facilitated the rise of the KKK and other white supremacist groups. And obviously that was very consequential in the 1930s, but it continues to be consequential today because those groups don't just go away over time. Those groups continue to persist, institutions are long-lasting, which then leads to the perpetuation of hate, violence, racial prejudice in those areas even today. Okay? And I think it you know, in some, I think that this paper sort of very much highlights this causal evidence that we have of the far-reaching effects of entertainment media and imagery. Again, even in ways that perhaps are unconscious to the viewer. People went to go watch Birth of a Nation, not necessarily because they had these racist inclinations when they entered the theater, but because they wanted to see, you know, this form of entertainment. That form of entertainment was obviously incredibly racist, which then led to the creation and the perpetuation of some of these ideologies in practice. So just to wrap up, the director of the Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith, has said himself, in hindsight, you know, I had no idea the Birth of a Nation might be used to revive the old plan. The terrific power lies in the motion picture. I'm constantly amazed and sometimes almost terrified by it. I think there's increasingly evidence that we should very much be thinking critically about media, about what we're putting out there, because it's not always just a reflection of our own beliefs. Even if it is, that could have some lasting impact on behaviors, on preferences, on attitudes, etc., in ways that actually harm certain groups. So thank you so much for your time.
I'm privileged and honored and certainly challenged to be here tonight. And I know you are, Tim. I don't know if we can sit in our seats, but now I know why certainly everybody needed to get an adult beverage. There's so much I think that could be said in addition to the wonderful presentation that we heard about the statistics. One big thing I know Tim and I are going to talk about is the involvement of the president with all of this. President Wilson, who actually went to school with Dixon, who wrote Klansman. They were at John Hopkins together, and then were able to, Griffith came in, who was an actor, and they all kind of merged together and were able to get President Wilson to show this film as the first film ever shown in the White House. The impact and implications of that are terrific. And the fact that the movie, when you see it, it has bylines, you know, it has little dialogue written in there. That dialogue was taken from books that President Wilson had written. So there is so much thickness to the story of Birth of a Nation. The implications of it from a statistical point of view or something. And yes, there were cities that did not accept it. Cleveland, Providence, Rhode Island, and Chicago refused to show it. There was an effort, W.E.B. Du Bois in New York City went to City Hall and said, you cannot show that. He didn't win. Monroe Trotter, who was a tremendous writer in Boston, went to, I believe it was Mayor Walsh, and begged him not to show it. There was a big protest, about 5,000. I think it's important to talk too about something that wasn't mentioned, the attitude of Black people at this time about showing the film, the reaction to it. And because of understanding what it was going to mean to those communities. You had 5,000 Black people show up and protest the movie when it was being shown in Boston. And yet Trotter came in, was locked up. The governor got involved and they said, well, there's a law against immoral shows and things that can cause mayhem in the community. And we're going to see if this is one of them. And it was sent to a judge named Dowd. Dowd just went to see it. He said, I have to see the movie. I can't judge it without seeing it. He went to see it and he said, basically, it's not bad. But what we're going to do is take out two of those scenes. The scene being the one of the Black man attempting to rape the white woman so she commits suicide. And I can't remember what the other one was. But Griffith went ahead and showed it anyway. And this notion that at the end, he said, oh, I didn't know it was going to do all of this. He absolutely did. He came from a very Southern family. He was very upset that his family lost everything during Reconstruction. He was very angry about it. He wrote about it. And so was Wilson. So we're dealing with a president who in fact resegregated the federal government and who showed the movie and whose words were used to the movie. So the words that I remember from D.W. Griffith were, "This using the president is a powerful weapon." And that is how I see the movie going forward. And movies beyond Birth of a Nation, you know, you're right when you say that it's, and I'm going to stop, Tim, I'm going to stop. But Birth of a Nation was used to teach filmmaking. Spike Lee, when he went to NYU and got involved in filmmaking, that was one of the films that was shown. And he became very upset. He and another filmmaker named Dickinson, they became very upset, and this is in the 1970s. And they became very upset. And in fact, ultimately, Spike Lee wrote a film in response to Birth of a Nation called The Klansman. And if you see it, you'll see that he has taken out of Birth of a Nation certain depictions from Birth of a Nation itself. The real response to Birth of a Nation from cinema, though, and I hope that all of you will look at this as well, was Oscar Micheaux, who was a Black filmmaker, the first Black filmmaker, actually, who wrote a film as well called, and I'll think of it, Within Our Gates. And it was in response to Birth of a Nation that depicted Black people as ignorant, stupid, racist, vile, even ugly, everything negative that you could think about. And so Oscar Micheaux's entire existence as a filmmaker was to start off trying to undo the impact of this film, Birth of a Nation, on white America. Because it was the first film, you know, came out of Nickelodeon. I didn't know what Nickelodeon meant. It meant 5 cents for the films, started in the 1800s with the help of people like Thomas Edison. So you can see I'm very much, I used to want to be a theater person, maybe you might guess that. And I'm certainly a person who is concerned about how this kind of attitude, these kinds of stereotypical beliefs, these kinds of notions of Black people, of Hispanics, of Native Americans. It's a whole nother thing about Westerns, Cagney, and how Westerns are looked. How does this factor and filter into the minds of people then and the minds of us now? That subconscious, that implicit, that underlying bias that the world has when they see Black men portrayed now as ignorant, criminals, liars, thieves, drug dealers. The Opportunity Agenda with Alan Jenkins, if you're interested, has written a whole piece on this and how the media has portrayed. It talks specifically about Black men and how that impacts, how that affects your thinking when you're making a decision. And we in the world of ADR know that the decisions are very subjective. And those of us who've been in the world of employment and civil rights know that subjective decision-making is filled with bias. And industrial psychologists will tell you it's everything from making assumptions that Black people are not as articulate, not as congenial, not as easy to get along with. And when you're walking into an environment that has this kind of mindset of who Black people are and Black men are, it makes the process, it makes our system very difficult. And I guess the next panel will talk about how to, and some panels I know CPR has done such a great job, and people like Homer LaRue, who's done such a great job of looking at how do we deal with some of those biases. And CPR certainly has put in place in its selection process ways of trying to overcome that. So I've gone on and on. Tim, please forgive me, but you and I are good friends. You know how I am.
No apology necessary. Well, first of all, let me again thank Bruce Byrd for that introduction. Thank CPR, Alan Waxman, Ellen Parker, everyone else at CPR who helped put this program together. Of course, my colleague Gail and friend. This is not our first go around. Gail and I have been on a couple, and we've always enjoyed it very much. And I also want to thank Professor Ang for putting together the presentation that he did. I think it's an important contribution. Last week, the president made an important nomination. He nominated Ketanji Brown Jackson to the United States Supreme Court. We knew that, because he said so, that he was going to nominate a Black woman for the first time in the history of this country. And some of the reaction to that was consistent with the legacy of the film that we've been talking about and the presentation that we just saw. There were comments, and you will hear more comments about how whether they are blatant and open or sort of encoded language or whatever it might be. But there's a Georgetown professor who may have lost his position. He was about to begin, who said, now we're going to have a lesser Black woman because than the best qualified people out there. And there have been other comments about why it was wrong to focus on a Black woman, even though President Reagan focused on Sandra Day O'Connor before she was nominated. I'm going to find a woman. He also focused on, I'm going to put the first Italian American on the Supreme Court. No problem. But for some reason, the issue of race always brings about this kind of reaction in one form or another. Why? Why is that? So while I do thank Professor Ang, I want to take issue with one of his last points, which was the importance of the continued importance of Birth of a Nation is that these groups like the Klan and white supremacist organizations persist to this day. It's not so much that these groups persist to this day, which they do, it's that these views persist to this day in one form or another, increasingly, or not necessarily, I should say, in the form of some overt white supremacist ideology, but too often masked in what we refer to as implicit bias. This is a program about the birth of a nation. I think it's called Birth of the Nation to Black Lives Matter and the implications for diversity and inclusion efforts in dispute management. But we are focusing really on the role of media. Media does play an important role in both proliferating and policing biases of all types. And that includes implicit racial bias. Implicit racial bias defines our national psyche. To believe otherwise is to be, if you'll pardon the expression, it's a bit harsh, but to be delusional. I mean, it's just to live a lie. Implicit bias, racial bias defines our national psyche. But the media does provide a platform, as I said, for both proliferating in some instances and for policing all forms of bias, including implicit racial bias. And it's complicated because in a nation that honors and celebrates freedom of thought, freedom of expression within certain very elastic boundaries, it's really hard to take the full measure of the media's impact on our conscious and subconscious implicit decision-making and biases. But in the matter of race, it is less hard. The impact, I believe, of, and Professor Ang believes, and as my colleague just pointed out, the impact of Birth of a Nation was demonstrable and measurable. And it continues to be to this day, in part because, as Gail just pointed out, in part because of its endorsement by the then President of the United States, who, by saying what he said about it at the time, helped enhance and further its racial myths. And he helped them to become more firmly embedded in the national psyche, up to and including today. Gail mentioned Thomas Dixon, the author, who was in fact a classmate of Woodrow Wilson's at Johns Hopkins. I think that probably had a lot to do with his endorsement of it, but he was an avowed racist. And when I say avowed, I mean he was a very deliberate, conscious,
Absolutely.
open racist and segregationist while he was president of Princeton, while he was governor of New Jersey, and during the entire time that he was president of the United States. He went about segregating every aspect of the United States government that he could get his hands on when he was president of the United States. And when he saw the film in the White House, his immediate response was, "This is history written with lightning. And my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." And that went out all over the place. That received wide publication that he had made that endorsement. As Gail pointed out, and as Professor Ang pointed out, this is a film that really was the biggest blockbuster of its day. It depicted white people as victims and Black people as villains. It had supposedly wonderfully benevolent slave masters being subjugated by newly freed Black people who were now taking political office and taking away the rights of these benevolent white slave owners. There are modern parallels to this today. There are, I mean, you know, it really, you don't have to look very far to find them. There was the scene that was discussed, played by Lillian Gish as the
Yes.
Who was, you know, who's threatened by this
Damsel.
Yeah, exactly. Threatened by this Black man, and the whole point of this was to depict this effort to take over and you know, you can see parallels in when President Obama was in office, and signs depicting him as an African in the jungle with a nose, a bone through his nose, holding a spear, and under the sign it said, "We want our country back." I mean, this was not the Klan that we're talking about. This was, I'm not going to say the name of it, but this was an actual viable political party. It's not the Republican or the Democratic Party, but it's an offshoot of one of those parties that was very significant and still is significant to this day. But the illegitimate presence of this Black man who's trying to subjugate us and take over our identities and so forth. The movie basically tried to depict and did depict Black people as intellectually inferior, and that certainly persists in our subconscious, in our implicit biases today, and it's what we are here to talk about in terms of the impact on decision making in terms of who to hire as a mediator, as an arbitrator, or as a lawyer, and how these continue to manifest and what we might be able to do to address some of these things. A few years, or actually 2 years ago, my friend Marvin Johnson wrote an article along with Maria Volpe, and really addressed some of the lingering effects of not specifically citing Birth of a Nation, but America's racist history, and in doing so, and its impact on arbitration, mediation, and panels and so forth. And in doing so, in order to frame the issue, he cites my former colleague when I was on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, Leon Higginbotham. And he refers to Judge Higginbotham's reference to a parable. And he used this parable in a presentation at the Public Justice Center's 10th anniversary celebration. This is back in 1995. I'm going to share it with you. So goes the parable. There were 4 fishermen fishing downstream. While they were fishing, they looked out in the middle of the stream and they saw 2 babies. They brought them out, and as soon as they got the 2 babies on shore, they looked out and there were 3 babies in the water. They ran back in and brought the 3 babies to shore, and then they saw 4 babies in the water. 3 of the 4 fishermen ran back into the stream to aid the babies, but the 4th fisherman did not go into the water. Instead, he started walking upstream. The other fisherman yelled, "Aren't you going to help?" The 4th fisherman said, "You save those babies downstream while I go upstream and find out why they are getting in the water in the first place." Marvin writes about this: "The fishermen initially were focused on catching fish. Seeing the babies in the water was an emergency. The fishermen began pulling the babies out of the water to solve the problem they were facing. While this response may be helpful in the moment, focusing only on the symptom will not solve the problem. We must determine the source of the problem to solve it. And in this parable, as with other problems we face, we must do what the 4th fisherman did. We must go upstream to detect the source of the problem to solve it. Otherwise, we will spend all of our time dealing with the symptom and not solving the problem." I was on a call about a week and a half ago, and we were trying to adopt a program to address diversity and inclusion efforts at an organization that I'm on the board of. And one of the board members said, "Well, just as long as we don't look back, because people are trying to make everybody feel guilty by looking back nowadays. We need to look forward. I'm all in on solving these problems, but we need to look forward. Unless we understand the meaning of the birth of a nation and the impact it had on our national psyche then and continues to have now, by looking back and looking at it squarely and not denying the truth of all of that, we will be like the other fisherman instead of the 4th fisherman who jumps in and goes up and tries to find out the source of the problem in order for us to address it." And it can be addressed, and it is being addressed. I saw that Homer LaRue is here with us this evening. And I know that Alan Waxman and CPR have endorsed the Ray Corollary. And there are a number of other efforts out there that we're all aware of and working on, and people writing and fighting to try to do just that, to try to see what happened and what can we do about it now. But unless we're willing to look back and understand the impact of this history on where we are today, we will not win in this battle. So I hope we have somewhat of a discussion. I guess we can share some thoughts and ideas and answer questions. Thank you.
You. As a footnote, thank you, Tim. Thank you for always enlightening and providing such wonderful information for us. As a footnote back to about the film, when we mentioned Blacks in the film, none of the actors in the film were Black people except for sidekick roles. You know, those roles were all white people in blackface. And when you mentioned the Supreme Court, it reminded me that back then, the Supreme Court Justice Douglas White went to see Birth of a Nation along with 500 other extraordinarily well-heeled persons in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. And they were the ones who actually pushed it forward as being something to look at and think about. And when you talk about where we've been and where we are, we've seen some of that recently. Within the past few years, we've seen persons at the helm pushing forth with racist ideas and beliefs and spurring people on. You know, this notion that you are taking from me, as in after during the Reconstruction period, and this notion now that I don't have a job because you Black people, you Hispanics, you're taking it all, you know, is still very much with us. And you're right. How do we? What are the ways that we can do it? You know, Homer, you're here. How do we do that? I don't know that everybody's heard about the Ray Corollary, and it's so phenomenally wonderful, the front end and the back end. To perhaps you would share some of that with us if you're still here.
I am still here, and thank you, Gail, and thank you, Tim, both for your contributions to this discussion. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I do want to draw the connection between what you've been talking about in terms of the film and where we are today. Because I think that the takeaway from the film, yes, thankfully, we don't see the degree of violence that we saw and that the author depicted as a result of Birth of a Nation. But I think that one of the things that we do still see is this notion that somehow when we begin to talk about race, then we have to talk about qualifications, and not an assumption that Blacks, Browns, and other underrepresented people are qualified, but we assume immediately that they are not qualified, and that we then need to revert to the question of, let's create training programs, let's create pipeline programs, diverting our attention from the fact that there are qualified persons who are not being selected. Tim mentioned Marvin. Marvin and I did a project 20 years ago called Access ADR, and was focused on the same question or the same issue, that there are qualified persons of color and women who are not being selected as mediators in disputes. And we tried to bring about a program that would make that would counter that. One of the proponents of that program said to us, and Marvin and I laughed, but as Blacks have to laugh from time to time, when he said to us, "My God, I never thought that Access ADR would be so hard." And we both said, "You haven't walked in our shoes for the last 30 years. And I think that that captures, we have to the last point I want to make is we have to be very careful about allowing the question of selection of mediators and arbitrators to revert to a question of pipeline. Yes, we have to deal with the pipeline, but we cannot allow the pipeline issue to divert us from the selection process and the bias that is as a part of that. And that's what the RCI is intended to deal with. Thank you.
No, Helmer, thank you. And thank you for all of your work. And I hope that everyone on this gathered here tonight will take a look at the Ray Corollary Initiative and what it's doing, what it means, and why it's so important. I just want to touch on one point that Homer just made. I've said this many times because it's true and because I've seen it over and over again. And Homer just alluded to it. When I refer to unconscious bias, I'm not suggesting that anybody is bad. I'm not suggesting that anybody is ill-intentioned. I'm not suggesting that anyone isn't doing their very best. I think we are all burdened by unconscious biases in one form or another. What I'm talking about is what Homer just made reference to, the burden. I've been a lawyer for 42 years now. And in my 42 years as a lawyer, as a federal district court judge, as a circuit court judge, and having left the bench and pursued a career in ADR and in other areas, and just working on corporations on boards and all, the one thing that I have seen over and over and over again is that for my white colleagues who are as educated as I am and who are as experienced as I am and so forth, competence is typically it's presumed. For my Black colleagues and myself, there is a burden of proof. And this is the burden that Homer was just talking about. And you have to get past that burden of proof because you don't get the benefit of that presumption. Now, there's a certain point where everybody has to prove themselves, and we accept that. Everybody has to establish that they are up to the task at hand and whatever that might be. But going into just being selected, there are certain presumptions and there are certain burdens, and they are largely, in my experience and from what I've seen over the many years that I've been doing this, they are largely allocated based on race, on gender, and some other immutable characteristics that I think manifest in what I refer to as unconscious bias. And I think it's baked into our collective psyches in many respects because of events like Birth of a Nation and its progeny, so to speak, over the decades.
Yes.
You know,
afterwards.
if I might jump in here, first of all, thank you to both of you, Gail and Tim, for sharing your reflections, and of course, Homer. I find this study very powerful because it suggests to me what you refer to as unconscious or implicit bias, what Isabel Wilkerson refers to as the development of the caste system, and how this film further entrenched that. But it seeds these views to this day in ways that are insidious. And as I watch this and think about this, and you'll excuse me, I'm a former pharma guy, it's a bit like the virus. It spreads. It could be invisible. It's passed down from generation. It's passed down by people, not necessarily who intend anything bad by it, but who don't even realize they're being infected, myself included. And much like the virus, we have to be vigilant about 6 feet apart, wear masks, take inoculation and so forth, but to take affirmative steps to combat this virus that has been passed down through the community in these biases that we all hold. And I think this study is a very powerful reminder. I've never seen Birth of a Nation. I would venture to say a lot of folks have never seen Birth of a Nation, but that doesn't mean we're not infected by any number of the viruses that have come from that film. And I think efforts like the Ray Corollary Initiative or other initiatives is indeed our way of taking those vigilant steps that we need to take to combat the virus. So I'm just so struck that it is there. It is there, and it is there till this day.
Yeah, it's Birth of a Nation, and I like the way Tim put it, and it's progeny. It's the things that we look at now. It's whether we look at Kojak, all those old movies that we were bred on, to see images of Black people that are negative, and they filter into our subconscious mind. My old role was with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as a civil rights lawyer with a specialty in employment discrimination, and a greater specialty, which was suing the federal government for discrimination, particularly against Blacks and on the basis of race. The notion of subjective decision-making when we're talking about the ADR world is something that's bothered me for a very long time. Because when we look at the criteria, and I said this a minute ago, that's used to make decisions about who's going to be selected: congenial, get along, articulate, appearance, things that are extraordinarily subjective and that allow for that. How do we, within our community, our ADR community, how do we change that? How do we change things that industrial psychologists, those people who specialize in the world of work, will tell you is the halo effect? If you're white and you do one thing that's great, you have one great mediation, one great arbitration, Joe, in looking for somebody else, says, yeah, I know Phil Walsh, he's great. He did a great case. That halo effect stays around him forever and ever, and it gets passed on. And we're talking about an industry that bases much of its referrals on who do you know, and if we were working in the world of work, which ADR and these referrals is not, we could come after that in a little, in a bigger and better kind of way, looking at some of the tools that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has created for us. But we need to be straightforward, honest, and look this thing in its face and say that we know these processes. And Tim, you've said it so well tonight. The processes that are used for selection, and certainly the Ray corollary looks at that, are subjective decision making and have nothing to do, and the other part of it is that they're not job related. They don't have any correlation between doing a good job and another. Let's be frank about that. So until we're really able to take this issue by the horns, and I do believe, yes, Alan, I do believe that we need some work on changing our attitudes and our values. But I also believe, like Martin Luther King, I may not always be able to change your values and your viewpoints, but I can change the way you do business with legislation and with law and with action. And sometimes that is going to be, I believe, I firmly believe that that's going to be some of what it's going to take. After all, it's a competitive world. And anytime you can create barriers that keep people out to keep a bigger piece of the pie for yourself, until we see that, as McCulloch said back in the days of 1964, before the creation of the Civil Rights Act, we as a nation must see that we are not working on all 8 cylinders. We're working on 4. And until we're capable of working on all of them, we won't be the strong nation that we need to see. And it's a very timely thought right now when we see where we are as a nation in this world, and in this world of great turmoil and great challenge in terms of our democracy and the democracy that we've had. So let's take that challenge on, and let's do something about it within our practices, within our referrals, within our families, and within our communities, if we're really able to try to change this and keep our democracy the way it is. Not the way it is, better.
Well said, and I agree with everything that, as I usually do, Gail. Does anyone have anything that they would like to share, or any experiences or insights or any lessons from what we just saw, or their own experience with the legacy of what we just saw? Anyone?
Or any questions?
Or are there any questions? Yeah, sure. I can tell you.
I would like to know how many people have seen Birth of a Nation? How many? I've seen it too many times. If you haven't seen it, it's online. There's a movie too to see that came out the year before Birth of a Nation called Squaw Man, about Native Americans, done by Oscar Micheaux. And not Oscar Micheaux, by the other with the French name, Cecil DeMille, sorry, 1914. And it would be interesting to, if you haven't seen both of those, to see them and to see the characterizations and the stereotypes of the squaw and the beauty, the Pocahontas type, that carry on within our attitudes about who people are. Films and Asians, I used to be on the board of the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. And recently there was a great discussion about the portrayal of Asians in the film industry as well, and how that impacts and has not only, and we haven't really talked about this, not only how the power base, how whites may see Blacks or Hispanics or Asians, but how those groups see themselves, how those values, how those images, how those stereotypes affect young Black men in particular. That create anxiety, create a lesser sense of self. And the agenda does a really fantastic job of documenting and studying those issues. So it's a complex kind of issue, and I think that we really have to make some changes within the way we see ourselves and the way we see others as well.
Well, for those who are in positions of leadership who are here tonight, or who are in senior positions at law firms or your companies or whatever it might be, I just want to note again the significance of what the president did in 1922 when this was screened at the White House. Just imagine for a moment if Woodrow Wilson had, instead of handling it the way he did, had issued a statement condemning Birth of a Nation and saying, These are horrible, vicious, racist lies. And this is a country built on principles of freedom and equality, and we cannot and will not tolerate this. And I deplore it. And I urge everyone around the country to boycott the film and refuse to see it, and instead to focus on projecting real, true images of our collective humanity. Just think for a moment if he had done that, or something like that, instead of what he did. So I think that there's a lesson there for leaders, because we can all do this in our firms, in our offices, and say, no, I'm not going to go with that. No, I'm going to go in another direction here and try to do what I can to redress what has obviously been a problem for decades. I want to be a part of helping to solve it. So if it means taking a chance on somebody I don't know, I'm willing to do that. If it means looking aggressively for folks that I know have been historically excluded from active and meaningful participation in this realm, I'm all in. Let's do it. Let's try to do what we can to help level the playing field here, because it's not just the right thing to do. It actually might help us with our employment contracts, with arbitration clauses, because it might get more buy-in if we have people that are from a broad spectrum of background and experiences among those who are helping to decide those issues, and our employees know that, or whatever it might be. The integrity of this field is all that's at stake here. I mean, and so I just think that there's a leadership lesson here that's important to comprehend and hold on to also. And
Agreed.
okay.
As LBJ would say, we shall overcome. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And the last president would be one of the ones to fall into the realm and the category of a Wilson, truly.
Yeah.
Someone should ask a question that would allow us to end on a more positive note than my past reference. I would appreciate it.
Well, if they don't, then I'll give you one.
All right.
I do think that everyone might want to check out the CNN. Here I am touting CNN, the special on LBJ that's been, I don't know what part we're up to now, or maybe they've all been released. It's really an excellent insight into his leadership.
It really is.
Problems and his inner turmoil, and really he was kind of tortured, of course, during the Vietnam War. But we can, ending on LBJ is not a bad thing, actually.
And another good film to watch to get a real sense of the concept of power and how it's been looked at around the world is Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes. It's a very powerful documentary, and I highly recommend it. And another is the book.
Before you talk about that, we do have go ahead. Go ahead.
Colorization, 100 Years of Black Films in a White World by Will Haygood. He has a very fine introduction about Birth of a Nation and talks about films that come after that, Black exploitation, and the impact that these films have had on our broader community and our world. So
Will
I highly
Haygood
recommend.
also wrote The Butler, by the way, which was a very
He
good.
certainly did. He
But
wrote The Butler.
We have a question here. I'll read it, and maybe you want to take from Kai. It says, how do you think this is affecting the next generation of lawyers that are growing up with diverse leaders as something more natural instead of exceptional? Is there a strong shift to, or do you see the possibility of these problems being perpetuated? I will just, before Gail, I'll just tell you, I think it's wonderful and great. My children do not understand much of what we are talking about right now because they see the world through a different lens. Their experience has been different in many respects. They've been fortunate. They've gone to the best schools and they've been around wonderful people and they've lived in safe neighborhoods. But I will tell you that the lens that in fact, there are times when it bothers me because I think, can't you get a little angry about this stuff? I mean, and they do. They are angered. They're angered by injustice. But I have a bit more indignation, I guess, and I'm still working on than they do because of my life experience. I'm glad for them because they have benefited from seeing leaders who are multiracial, multicolors and genders and so forth of people, and they're just growing up differently. So I think that that is tremendous progress, and it bodes well. But I will say that that the decision makers now for people who are trying to serve as arbitrators and mediators and get on panels and so forth and so on are not of my children's generation. And so there's still a lot of learning to do and teaching to do to try to help open more doors so that when they get there, that will be common and ordinary for them too. Gail?
Yeah, I have a son who's the age, I believe, of your children, Tim, and he somewhat feels the same way, but he can't feel totally that way with a mother like me, because he maintains a sensitivity, not about himself, you know, he's a privileged child, but about what's going on in the bigger world as we talk about Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in this country. The demographics are dismal. They're as bad, and if we look at all the indicators of housing, employment, home ownership, morbidity and mortality rates, we are where we are as Black people. Let me just use Black people as we were in 1975, as where we were when Nixon was president. So while we have these little openings, these little crevices that mean that there may be one more partner in the firm, but when you look at the number of Blacks coming out of law school now, and you see that going into the firms and moving it up is not as good as it should be. You know, we have to look at that. And even in those little crevices that moving up, when we look at CEOs for major companies in this country, the numbers have dropped. They haven't gone up, they've gone down. So that when we look at a group, when we look at small crevices that those of us who are privileged as Black people fall into, great. But when we look at the overall, the statistics are dismal. They're not where they should be. And I think that we have to keep our eye on the prize. And the eye on the prize is to create a more democratic, a more open, a more inclusive environment for all of us. And that takes hard work, heavy lifting. And my son knows I'm ready to always do it, and I've gotten him to try to do it too. Because otherwise it's kind of, you know, when we look at television now, we look at images and we still look at it and see what's happening. Things are not, it's kind of almost a superficial glance at where we are. And I don't mean to say I'm not optimistic and hopeful and all of that, but I'm also a pragmatist. Who is it who said she's not an optimist? Stacey Abrams. I'm a pragmatist. You know, I'm looking at the reality of where we are and how we're going to really make this thing work, you know, because of all.
Question. We have another question. This is from Margie Echevarria. Do you think the publication of actual selection of diverse neutrals by the service providers will help them impact the gatekeepers to improve the statistics? I wonder, is Alan here? Alan might be in a better position to answer that question. I don't know whether Alan is still with us, but Homer follows that up with there must be a metric such as that proposed. So
yes.
Alan is here.
Right.
Alan is here.
Yeah.
And there are already created panels. You know, the American Bar Association has lists of diverse mediators: Black, Hispanic, Asian, women, persons with disabilities, gay. The National Bar Association has a tremendous list of certified, qualified mediators and arbitrators. So finding people, you know, when Homer talks about the front end and the back end.
I think the obvious answer is yes. I mean, that yes, the publication of actual selection should, I can't understand how it could not help impact the so-called gatekeepers. Because I mean, I just, let's put it this way. When you see people out there in more numbers who are getting selected and who are coming back again and getting selected or whatever, the numbers are becoming significant enough then how could that not open even a closed mind to the possibility that maybe it is safe to do this? Maybe it's not such a bad idea. I mean, Homer, if you're here, I mean, I see that Homer, he must be here because he has a note here. Do you agree, Homer? If you can hear me.
Yes, but I want to go back to something that both of you have said before, and that is that there's got to be a concerted effort on the part of the ADR community that first sees the question of selection not only as a question of a pipeline, but sees the question as one that requires an institutional, I guess, response. And the 30% metric is intended to do that. And if we can create the kind of institution like Diversity Labs has done for the Mansfield Project, for the ADR community, in which transparency, data collection, and holding one another accountable, that will move the ball. We cannot continue to just simply aspire that more diverse neutrals be selected. We can't simply say that it will happen naturally once we get 30% into the pipeline. That is a false narrative in my mind.
I agree, but I will say that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked, when will you be satisfied with the number of women on the United States Supreme Court? She said, when there are 9. and we are about to have 4 out of 9. And that is, so my point is that I totally agree with everything that you just said. But my point is that as that becomes more, almost unexpected, if not routine, then kind of unexpected, or it's not even that noticeable now. I mean, it's just a part of our culture and a part of who we are and part of our identity, that this is how this institution is constituted. And the same, I think the same is true in our profession. I hope. I've seen that happen with women largely, much more over the past, I don't know, 15 years or so in our field. It's, anyway, I agree with everything you say. I just think that the answer to the question that was asked is it can only help, in my judgment, but I do agree with you, Homer.
By the way, I'm sorry I wasn't responsive before. I agree as well that tracking and accountability are important tenets if we're going to drive this change.
Right.
So can I ask a question? I agree too. I mean, I think seeing the statistics, if they're positive, will help. But how do you get the decision makers to, and maybe you can't put the implicit bias aside, but I have seen as well, the roadblock is the hesitancy, or maybe that's just the mask, but the hesitancy to appoint someone they don't know. And that's a big gate too, right? But when you get general counsel saying, I can't give this big case to someone I don't know, I have to talk to my board. You know, how do we get past that?
I think the same way.
I'd like to answer that. I wrote an article called Changing the Face of ADR, which was published in the docket. And that excuse about the bet the firm case is constantly brought up as a barrier to selection. When the fact is, if any service provider looked at their cases, the bet the firm cases might be 10% of the whole. And then there would be, 30% of these low-level cases, 20% of mid-level cases, et cetera, et cetera. There'll be the variation in that bucket. So I can't believe that even a new ADR professional who has been an attorney for a number of years because they don't graduate from law school and become ADR professionals, cannot handle those low-level cases, those mid-level cases until they feel qualified enough to deal with that bet the firm case, or because of their experience inside a corporation or in private practice as partners of a law firm and then transition into ADR, can't take care of that bet the firm cases because they've been handling that in their firms. So that is an excuse.
Okay. No,
That
I agree.
tested.
No, I
A
agree with you.
subterfuge, a real
And-
subterfuge. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
I've also used the argument in talking to people about this and signing up for the commitment and expanding their pool of who they would select from is, I've always wondered, you go into an arbitration, someone generally wins, the other side generally loses. Maybe there's a happy medium, but I've asked people to examine how they've done with the arbitrators they supposedly knew versus the ones they didn't know. And can they honestly say they've been so much more successful with the arbitrators they knew going in? I haven't done the study myself and it causes people to stop and think, but I'd be willing to bet if someone took a look at this. I think it also debunks the theory of, I can't do this case with someone, I'm not comfortable with someone I don't know. And I think, if they looked back at their history, they may say it didn't really help them.
That's one of the things that the RCI Inc. is committed to doing, that kind of research as well, because I do think that we need to develop and debunk those arguments that advocates are making. I don't know somebody, therefore I'm going to get a different outcome. My guess is, my hunch is that's not true. That's simply a gut reaction. If I don't know you, you don't look like me, you haven't been to my clubs, you haven't been to my church or synagogue or various other places, then you're likely not to think the way I think that you will think as an arbitrator. I think those are all falsities. But I think we also need empirical evidence, which we haven't done in the ADR field. And that's what the RCI, part of what the RCI Inc. is intended to do.
And that's why I made the question about whether publishing, whether the service providers publishing their stats would put pressure on all of those corporations and those law firms that have diversity policies and see how, in fact, they're living up to their avowed values.
Well, I agree with Tim that is what that could be one of the strategies that would be woven into the overall strategy. I don't think that in itself is enough, but I certainly would not say that that's not part of the strategy.
Yeah, but it would leverage the power of the service providers as well.
I just know that from my own experience that the notion itself, the premise itself is just a false premise that I need somebody that I know and I need somebody that, I mean, it's just ridiculous. I'm sorry, but I'm just cutting through all this stuff to tell you from my own experience that Margie's absolutely right. It doesn't really change anything. You find somebody who is good, whether you know them or not, whether you've used them before or not, whether it's Lane Phillips or somebody who just opened shop but has a really interesting background and is apparently or clearly capable of doing this. It's an excuse not to do it. That's really all that it is.
Yeah.
So, look, just call it what it is. I mean, but I've reached the point now where, and probably I'm too old to maybe say it more politely. That's basically what it's about. So anyway.
It's
Tim,
all
I
that-
join
you.
And
I am
what
at that age as well.
I'm not,
It's unfiltered.
yes.
Thank you for sharing perspectives, unfiltered and otherwise. Thank you all for the discussion.
Thank you.
This has been a terrific program. Bruce, I don't know if you're still here. Thank you to you for bringing this to us. Thank you to Sandra and her organization for having developed this. Thank you to Gail and Tim for leading our discussion.